Well, after a long year of using the Sony A74 just about every day, it's finally time for a review. Okay, so to start this, something I've always found really cool about film cameras is that their age has allowed us to get a general idea of their worth. Hall of Fame cameras like the Canon AE1 or the Nikon FM2 have that Hall of Fame status because they have been such good workhorses for such a long period of time. They have continued to be excellent cameras year after year. They are excellent tools with no gimmicks, and as long as you have a roll of 35mm film, you are good to go. Unfortunately, this doesn't apply to digital cameras. New camera models are constantly coming out, and even the most comprehensive reviews done by very qualified people are ultimately people who have not had that much time with the camera. So I think it's hard to get a better understanding of how those cameras will really work within our individual workflows. Longer term reviews allow us to have a better idea of how the cameras will behave when integrated in our workflows, but by the time they come out, people are often already looking towards the next thing. In spite of this, I decided to wait over a year to make this video so I can have a sound understanding of how the A74 behaves in my workflow and how it might work in yours. But enough of that, let's start with the review. So right off the rip, I want to say I'm not too much of a specs guy. I'm not that interested in minute details, and I'm much more interested in how a camera works in a macro sense across everything that I do. I also want to say I'm not too into all the functions that cameras have nowadays, and I like kind of just the bread and butters that I think are really useful. But general specifications are important, so if you're unfamiliar, let me run through some of the things you'll want to know about the Sony A74. And just to preface this, keep in mind that this is a hybrid camera, sort of meant to split the difference between the photo-focused A7R line and the video-focused A7S line. There's a 33 megapixel full-frame sensor, 10-bit 422 4K 24 FPS video, 10-bit 422 4K 60 FPS video, 1080p at 120 FPS, and 10 FPS continuous shooting. So there you have it. Maybe that's helpful to you, but all that really matters to me is that 33 megapixel full-frame sensor, 4K at 24 FPS, and 4K at 60 FPS. That's kind of it. Specs are a really solid, foundational sort of starting point to understand the value of a digital camera. But before I get into the files and all that stuff, I do want to take a step back and talk about the physical build of the camera itself. So the Sony A74 is pretty chunky as far as modern mirrorless cameras go. It's actually very similar to the professionally aimed Sony A9 cameras that have a much more pronounced, larger hand grip. A lot of people seem to like this more pronounced grip, but personally I like the older grip on the thinner Sony A7 II, and I think that might just be because I have smaller hands. As far as materials go, I have no idea what this thing is made of. I did some Googling to try and figure it out, but couldn't find anything, but I will say it does feel pretty good in the hand. What I don't like though is that it has this rubberized grip on it, and I said that's a bad thing because my Sony A7 II had a rubberized grip, which came pretty seriously undone. So if it does that, I'd be upset, but if it stays durable, then I'll be fine with it. The Sony A74 is also weather sealed, which means it's at least resistant to dust and water, which is a huge deal for anyone who's into things like landscape photography, like I am. Now that's not a guarantee against the elements, but it does go a long way, and I think it's especially important to pair it with something like a weather sealed lens. Okay, and again, this is a hybrid camera, so that does get us a couple cool things. First, Sony blessed this camera with a fully articulating flippy screen. This is a godsend of a feature that I want on every camera that is meant to shoot video. There's also a dedicated dial up top, so you can switch between photo, video, and SNQ mode, and honestly I thought this was a little bit annoying to switch with at first, but it comes in clutch with the memory recall function that we'll touch on later. The physical UX on the A74 is pretty solid, and for the most part, they got it locked down. Adjusting core settings like aperture, ISO, and shutter speed is no problem with dedicated dials, and there's plenty of remappable buttons to customize. I honestly haven't had the need to customize any of these buttons because anytime I need to change something that isn't in the exposure triangle, it's usually just a few presses away through the function menu, which has much deeper pockets for changing your image. The function button also displays different options based on whether you're in photo or video mode, which is pretty convenient. Now, part of the reason this camera has a more pronounced hand grip and is so chunky is because it uses the NP-FZ100 batteries, which are significantly larger than the ones that came with the Sony A7 II. They are bulky, but holy shit, do they last. I bought 3 of these when I purchased my camera, and I have never used the third one. Seriously, every time I go out to shoot, and I'm talking shooting for videos, for photos, and both simultaneously, I have never dipped into the third battery. Usually I just finish the first one, and that's about it. Now I know that's not a very objective metric, but I will say the battery life on these guys compared to the A7 II that I had before is night and day. Rounding out physical specs, we have some ports that have professionals, or wannabes like myself, in mind. This camera has dual SD card slots and one CF Express slot, which doesn't matter because I'm not rich, though I do appreciate the dual SD card slots. Even though I pretty much only exclusively use one SD card, I always keep another one in there just for redundancy and peace of mind. The other side of the camera has audio in and out, a full-size HDMI port, and USB-C. These all get used: microphone, audio monitoring, easy video monitoring with that full-size HDMI, and USB-C to top off my camera when my other batteries are charging. Oh, and I guess I'll mention the viewfinder. I didn't care about viewfinders until I started shooting film, but now I have a bit more of an appreciation for them. Like most modern digital cameras, the Evf is great. You can see exactly where you're shooting and any relevant information you want, like the histogram or gyroscope. The only problem with it is that the sensor gets confused a little too easily for my preference. It'll often think that you have the camera up to your eye when you don't, causing the screen to black out. So now I want to talk about the files and the actual photographs that you get from the Sony a7 IV, and I think the best way that I can describe them is really solid starting points. Now, I don't think that a picture of a RAW in a video will get too many photographers excited, because that doesn't really mean anything. And I don't want to talk about JPEGs because I don't know shit about them and I have not used them in years. Anyways, this camera is a great digital camera because it gives you a massive, huge, customizable 7000 by 4500 image for you to do whatever you want with. That's why I use this camera. It gives you so much room to play around with, and if I want stuff baked in before I shoot, then I look to film. But for everything else, this is where I go. To reiterate, these files are extremely flexible. You can push and pull on them all day in Lightroom, and you will not see them really collapse unless you were going to the absolute extremes. I know some people need that juicy, high ISO performance, and I think the a7 IV really delivers there. Back in February, I did a self-portrait shoot, and I was kind of in like this wooded area of Central Park, and had my ISO cranked all the way up to 12,800. And to be honest, I think the photos came out really, really well. So well, in fact, that I think the grain actually adds something to these images. This is also another example of being able to transform these flexible RAW files into whatever you want. Speaking of that self-portrait session, it was also an excuse to use the Imaging Edge mobile app, which used to be a complete dumpster fire, but now is much better. It's not perfect by any means, but I did find it to be a workable remote shutter for a low-stakes scenario. As far as video is concerned, I think the files look good with some help in post. I don't want to get too into the nitty-gritty because I don't know all that much about it. I pretty much use S-Cinetone, call it a day, and then grade in DaVinci Resolve. Because I only really shoot video for YouTube and view these videos on small monitors, any sort of quality differences don't really jump out at me. One of the strongest points in my experience with this camera has been how good its autofocus is, and that's one of the main reasons I actually upgraded from the Sony a7 II to the a7 IV, is because the a7 II autofocus was really rough and it kept on missing when I was doing these talking headshots. This thing, when paired with the Sony lenses at least, never misses when I'm doing these talking headshots. It is incredible, and it also holds up for things like product B-roll. So the continuous autofocus is really strong, and I've also had great experience with the single shot AF and a handful of portrait sessions that I did. I don't think I missed focus in really any of the shots that I took over probably 500 images taken. Compared to older generations like the Sony a7 II, it runs circles around it. The a7 IV has an absolutely cavernous menu system, so I'm not going to get into all that because it's too much for my non-fully developed brain. Instead, I want to talk about one feature I really care about, and that is memory recall. So memory recall isn't a new function, but it is something that's new to me. The a7 IV is the first camera that I've owned that I've used it on. So if you're not familiar with it, let me explain it real quick. So the top of the camera has the usual modes like automatic, program, aperture and shutter priority, and manual. But there's also 3 more modes just labeled 1, 2, and 3. And the way these work is that you can just choose the settings you want and then set them to that mode. Pretty much, you just pick out all your settings, map it to a number, and then whenever you go back to that mode, it remembers those settings. I used to get so frustrated because every time I wanted to switch between photo and video, I had to adjust something to compensate for that 1/50 shutter speed that I was using. But this solves that issue entirely. Right now, I only use this for video settings, but it's unique to the mode that you're in, which is pretty cool with that mode switching dial that I mentioned earlier. So your 1 in photo mode is different from your 1 in video mode, which is different from your 1 in SNQ mode, and the same for your 2 and your 3. And now that I'm thinking about it, I should at least set something for the photo modes just to try it out. Anyways, as much as I'd love to judge a camera solely by its performance on the photos and the videos that it puts out, I'm a little bit too superficial for that, so I want to take a moment to talk about aesthetics. Unfortunately, the Sony a7 IV isn't a camera that I'm really drawn to pick up whenever I'm just going out. I think it's chunky, I think it's heavy, and I honestly think it's quite a bit ugly, especially with that blaze orange ring that I have looked into getting covered up quite extensively. I genuinely wish this camera was at least a little bit smaller and maybe a little less weighty, but at the end of the day, that's not why I bought this camera. I bought this camera because it is an incredibly competent tool for the things that I use it for. It is meant to take great photos and solid videos in one device, and that it does very, very well. It's also worth mentioning that buying the A74 is the same as buying any interchangeable lens camera. You are buying into that lens mount as well. And as far as mirrorless cameras go, Sony has some of the deepest pockets in the game. They've been making FE lenses for about a decade now and have been allowing third parties to make lenses for a long time as well. This makes for an absolutely huge selection with options for most budgets. And I say most because I think the starting point is a bit steep compared to things like the Canon EF mount, which has great lenses for around $100. The only critique that I might have is that the Sony lenses don't seem to have that much character. And I know that's personal preference and all that, but I think some people care about that, while others don't. Personally, I don't care that much about it. If I did, I would just buy other lenses because I think there is lenses with character. I feel like those Voigtlander ones, they make those for the EF mount now, so there's definitely options out there, but for the Sony lenses, for Sony cameras, they feel a little clean, a little clinical. Honestly, I've gotten around this by slapping a ProMist filter on and have really enjoyed the results, but mileage may vary. And I know I just mentioned that this isn't a camera that I'm always reaching for, and part of that is the size, and I think another thing is ultimately the cost. I did pay full retail of $2,500 for this camera, and I do fall victim of the trap of paying so much for gear that you almost baby it in a way, and you don't use it to its fullest extent. And while I have gotten around that, I'd say for the most part, I definitely don't always feel like bringing this camera absolutely everywhere with me, because sometimes I'm just like, oh god, like if something happened, like I would be out so bad. And even though I'm telling you guys this, like I don't feel drawn to pick it up, it's not about being drawn to picking it up necessarily, it's about do I pick it up? And I do. For the large majority of my photo and video work, probably upwards of 80%, this is the camera that I'm using. I would say maybe that other 20% goes to my Canonette, but really everything does get done with this camera. It's not like I'm not using it. I think sometimes when I just have a spur moment decision, or if I'm just running out real quick, and it's between this and the Canonette gets the play there because it does have that lower cost, the lower kind of fear of anything happening to it, and just the smaller form factor. So that's all my thoughts on the Sony A74 after a year of using it, and I know I feel like I come off a little bit harsh in my reviews, but I want to be explicitly clear that I think this is an excellent camera. Having one camera body that does everything I need for digital photos and videos in one, I think is very, very impressive, and does it very well with so many features that enhance the way I work. And it might not look as clean or as sexy as something like a Fuji or a Leica, but that's not why you buy this camera. As far as price goes, I don't want to make any statements saying whether or not this thing is worth it, because that's completely subjective based on everyone's different circumstances, whatever. I know this camera had a price increase compared to the last generation, but I did not have the Sony A7 III, and compared to the A7 II, this thing is 100% the real deal for me. At the end of the day, this is just a camera that I use a lot. It has features that help me work more efficiently, features that help me work more reliably, things that help me work with higher quality, and I think that's all stuff that's worth spending money on. So to me right now, the only question is whether or not this can last me longer than my Sony A7 II did. And there's some big shoes to fill, but I think you can do it. So, until next time. Whew, all right, that's a wrap.